This panel is going to talk about barriers to clinical research for people with serious mental illness from different perspectives. Dr. David Henderson, who's the chair and chief of psychiatry at Boston Medical Center, is going to moderate for us. He's a schizophrenia and global health researcher, cares a lot about stigma. Dr. Andy Nierenberg, bipolar extraordinaire. So along with Ellen Doederlein, created the Mood Network, which is funded by PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, as a way to actually engage all people affected by mood disorders in research. And Dr. Nierenberg is also a clinical trialist for bipolar disorder and depression. Next, Dr. Beverly Moy, who is a medical oncologist and the clinical director of the Breast Oncology Center here, who's also a leading expert on disparities nationally. And finally, we have Dr. Rich Schilisky, who's the chief medical officer of ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, who's thought a lot about broadening eligibility clinical trials within ASCO. And we're honored to have you all here. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's really great to be here, and every time I attend one of these things, I walk out saying, man, I got a lot of work to do. Because as the previous speakers have pointed out, that we really have to get to improving outcomes in patients with mental illness, and particularly those with cancer. And there's been a tremendous amount of progress that has been made, but I remember this one slide that showed all of the entry points where poor outcomes can happen. And so Dr. Irwin and her group are working on some of those entry points, but there's a lot more. And just the fact that there is a lack of mentally ill patients represented in cancer clinical trials is just absolutely astonishing to me. And it reminded me of a study that I was doing in Ethiopia. And we, as a schizophrenia researcher, we do clinical trials and stuff, and we set out to do a very simple study, a placebo-controlled trial with folate, vitamin supplement, safe and everything. And the government declined the study, and they basically said that it was unethical to do research in people with mental illness. And we wrote back, it's unethical not to do research in people with mental illness, and they approved it, luckily. But the point is that how do we get to better outcomes without conducting the work to show what the best approaches are? And so with our panel today, we're going to hear about how do we do that, and how do we get those people with mental illness involved in research. And so first up, I believe we have Dr. Moy.
Good morning, everyone. So I take care of patients with breast cancer. I've been the principal investigator and a co-investigator in multiple breast cancer treatment clinical trials. And I'm a researcher and advocate passionate about cancer disparities. So I think those are kind of the three ways that I think of this issue. And when you think about the optimal care of the cancer patient, I'm going to actually paraphrase and butcher something that I've heard Dave Ryan say several times, so I apologize. The best care of a cancer patient is essentially a three-legged stool. You can offer the best standard care, the best supportive and palliative care, and the best experimental care, okay? And probably the most vulnerable leg of that stool is the best experimental care. But in modern treatment of cancer in this genomic era, where we're seeing all these mutation-specific things, immunotherapy, all of these really exciting things that are happening, a lot of the best treatments, depending on the cancer, might only be available in clinical trials, okay, depending on the situation. So when you have populations that are vulnerable, that don't have access for whatever reason to clinical trials, we have a major social justice issue, okay? And if you think of this through the lens of cancer equity, classically, and rightly so, we think of vulnerable populations as patients of minority race or ethnicity, very poor patients, But I think that you can see from the data presented earlier by our Massachusetts Commissioner of Health and others that patients with severe mental illness are probably the most profoundly affected when they have cancer in terms of poor survival outcomes than others. So certainly patients with mental illness are in the population that are underserved and vulnerable. So it's probably more important that you make sure that they have access to all of those legs of the stool, okay? So why are there barriers to clinical trial participation? I'm not saying that they're all bad. They're actually, some of them are built in to protect patients, right? So as we heard earlier, about 50% of cancer treatment clinical trials exclude patients with mental illness. I've written clinical trials, and usually a lot of the exclusion and inclusion criteria are boilerplate language. You've got this table that you just reproduce. And usually towards the bottom, there's a bullet, patients with mental illness. And it just gets, carried on. But there are good reasons for that bullet sometimes and thought of it. And exclusion and inclusion criteria, first and foremost, are designed to protect the patients, the subjects going into trials, okay? And these clinical trials that we talk about with our patients are incredibly risky, right? Sometimes. They might be first in human trials, so this drug is being tested for the first time in a human being, either by itself or with combinations. So there are risks involved. And there are a lot of ethical things there you have to consider. Does a patient understand that? The whole informed consent process. If they understand that, can they make all the safety visits and assessments so that we can make sure that the patients are going to be okay? And that's a protective thing, right? And there's some perception, perhaps, that patients with severe mental illness need extra protection because maybe the informed consent process, especially in a very risky situation, might be greater. And maybe they won't be as compliant with their medical visits that are required, which are very burdensome. I mean, many of us in here have taken care of patients in phase 1 trials. They have to come in every week, they have to stay overnight, they have to be here all day. Very, very burdensome to people, okay? So that might be a noble reason why this exclusion criteria exists. But I also think there might be a very important but maybe less noble reason also, having been a trialist, in that a lot of times with these early phase trials, you really don't want to wreck the drug, right? You really want to make sure that patients, you've got one bad serious adverse event, it could everything could fall apart. And if a patient doesn't come back, or if a patient isn't assessed, you've got deviations, exclusions, all this stuff. It becomes kind of this nightmare, right? And I think that's somewhat less noble, but is probably a concern. And I've heard other trialists say, why did you enroll that patient? My God, you knew they weren't going to come in regularly. And I think that's kind of a little, maybe less attractive part of all of this. But I think that what we have to think about together is what barriers are important and what barriers should be more nuanced. We should be able to provide the best care for these patients, but I think that, and Rich will talk about this later, there are populations that have been excluded for many years, and now we're being thoughtful and saying, hey, wait a minute, why are patients with brain metastases being excluded from these trials? That can be silly, we can work this out. And I think this is a population that we certainly can work this out. I had a patient, triple negative disease in her 30s, young children, with bipolar disorder that enrolled in Kelly's initial pilot study. This patient did very well, working with psychiatry, working with us, made every single one of her adjuvant therapy visits not a problem. And we were able to successfully enroll into an immunotherapy vaccine study adjuvantly. I think you can think about patients' history and how well controlled their disease is and try to think about how we can really enroll these patients into trials. But I look forward to more of a discussion about all of these issues.
Thank you. Dr. Nierenberg?
So there are several things that have been mentioned that I think bear repeating. One was David said that we really need better outcomes. And also you talked about doing things together. One of the things that I think is really underappreciated is that in all of clinical trials, they're trying to get to better outcomes, and in part because the outcomes aren't good enough. So from the researcher's point of view, there's always the challenge of recruitment and trying to get people to accept the value proposition of why should I come into a trial. But it's always from the researcher's point of view. It's really not from the participant's point of view. And what we're trying to do in the Mood Network and through the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Network is, in a sense, change the entire way that we do things. And what we're trying to do is, rather than have a paternalistic type of relationship with the people who we're trying to help, instead we're trying to have a relationship that is a true collaboration to address a central problem. And the central problem is that there's a remarkable amount of uncertainty in what we do as clinicians. And we need to work together to be able to reduce that uncertainty and to then get better outcomes together. So how do we really do that? So there's something with the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, which is also known as PCORI, which is PCORI speak. And PCORI speak is its own language. And in PCORI speak, they talk about co-learning and co-production. And what they mean by that is that experts by experience, people who live with serious mental illness, work with the researchers to determine what are the questions that need to be addressed and how are we going to address those questions together. So it changes the entire tenor of the relationship from what I'm going to do as the researcher in the ivory tower is I'm going to design a study and I'm going to try to find people who will do what I tell them to do in the study, and they're good participants if they follow the sort of orders, if you will. Whereas you change it to, how can we do this together where you're not just a participant, but you're really a collaborator. And as somebody once said at one of the PCORI meetings, they didn't want to be invited to the table. What they wanted to do was go along and go shopping, cook together, and then you can eat together to figure out how you can do this as a collaborative rather than as the traditional, the highfalutin type of researcher imposing this on the people who you're trying to help. So really, in many ways, what we're trying to do is how we're all in this together. And one of the important things that Kelly said earlier is, at some point in our lives, we will all be patients, and we will all play that role. And so how do we, as in our role of patients, work with people who are trying to get better outcomes across all of medicine, but particularly in psychiatry?
So do you mean you want us to talk to our patients?
No, I mean, I want us to listen to our
Listen to them. Okay.
Very nice.
There we go. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Next up, we have Mr. Doederlein.
Yes.
Yes, you have a
may
microphone.
I trouble you for the trouble at all? Okay. So I want to acknowledge Dr. Irwin for a really great presentation. I think we can all agree, but also for putting all of this together, setting the table. How you set the table matters. And I would offer that one of the important things about the Mood Network that the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, my organization, and I are very proud of is that we're setting the table together. So very often when you're engaging in research, when you're conducting research, you are setting the table as the researchers. And to collaborate, to pick out the flatware, I'm trying to extend the metaphor and I'm just gonna abandon it. It's very important that origination point. And so I think that is something that I would offer as a step in any oncology related research, that there be the consideration that very likely you are going to have the co-occurrence of mental health conditions and or the triggering, re-triggering of mental health related issues by virtue of a harrowing experience. I also want to acknowledge Arthur and Stephanie for what they shared. Inspired by Arthur, I'm going to actually tell my story about research and the barriers through stories of my family, because my dad's name was Arthur. I have a mood disorder diagnosis. My late grandmother had bipolar disorder. My late father had bipolar disorder. Both my grandmother and Father Arthur also had cancer several times during their lives. I wasn't around when my dad had that experience, but I actually was, and some of my earliest memories are in a hospital because my grandmother was having her first and then second treatments for breast cancer. I remember the second time that it was very exciting, in part by virtue of being in a large, metropolitan area, having access to a world-class research hospital specializing in research in oncology, that my grandmother could have experimental treatments, new treatments that were investigational, that were in some ways risky, but that had a very good chance of improving her outcomes. And she did have success, though she did have a recurrence of breast cancer. She was cancer-free for about a decade after that second successful investigational trial. And there was no discussion, to my knowledge, of her mental health condition, although we all knew about it, and doctors would very likely know about it. There was no intersection or acknowledgement of that fact. When my grandmother died, she, as the commissioner presenced for us earlier, she died not by suicide. She did not die of wasting away because she was so miserable. She died of bone cancer, actually. I am certain, hearing our opening remarks, that the 30% greater mortality rate among people who have cancer and have mental health conditions, I'm certain, although I can't remember any examples of this, I'm certain that her cancer was probably addressed later than it would have been, because you couldn't always trust everything that Grandma said. And sometimes Grandma got confused. And we didn't talk about the fact that she had a mental health condition. We just, sometimes you have to listen to Grandma carefully. I then, with my father's experience, he was a professor and had many students, and it just so happened that when he's open about his experience of cancer, people would feel comfortable telling him that they were diagnosed with cancer, and he would advocate for, he would encourage participating in research. He had, when he received his cancer treatment when he was very young, participated in investigational studies, and I believe the studies were part of the transformation of care for thyroid cancer, which, though serious, and I don't want to make light of it, it is treatment-wise, there's a fairly high success rate. And, I never heard, ever, the idea of research for for mental health from my father. It's not that it was a bad thing to do. It never came up. Then you get to me, and I've not had cancer, and no intention there. I have had an easier go of it with the mental health issues than either my grandmother or father, and that's thanks to people like Andy, and I'm sure many people in the room. I had never thought about research in mental health until I started working for a mental health advocacy organization. And I, to this day, have never participated in mental health research. I've participated in research on asthma. I've participated in research on migraine headaches. So even among the educated, the enrolled, the engaged, there's a barrier. And some of the barriers are related to stigma, both external and internal, as we might expect. The chief issues in terms of participation in research among our depression and bipolar disorder support alliance constituents was risking any incremental progress they had made with existing treatments if they had to discontinue those to participate. And the other barrier was the privacy issues around sharing their information in any form with the research, with the researchers. That was a significant barrier people cited. I plan to participate in mental health research. I think the ethos in the oncology research community is part of why we have better outcomes in cancer, largely due to early detection and prevention. We don't have that research ethos, and frankly, we don't have that early detection and prevention ethos yet in mental health. But I think collaborating and learning from one another, we can create better outcomes in both conditions and also learn about how to get more people participating in mental health research as a matter of course. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Dr. Schilisky?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll stand up for a minute since I have a few slides to show. So first I want to thank Kelly and Beverly for inviting me to this very interesting meeting. I noticed on one of the slides of one of the previous speakers, Jimmy Holland's name. And I don't know, I assume many people know who Jimmy was. I don't know how many of you knew Jimmy personally. Jimmy, to me, was a friend, a colleague, a mentor, and along with her husband, Jim, of course, an iconic figure in oncology. You may know that both of them have passed away just in about the last 6 months, Jimmy just at the end of last year. So we've lost two great icons in cancer and psycho-oncology. I think if Jimmy was looking down on this room, she would be smiling to see the nature of this conversation. So I just wanted to acknowledge her. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that ASCO has focused on in the last couple of years on broadening eligibility criteria for cancer clinical trials. And of course, many of these points have already been made throughout the morning, so I'll try to be brief. There really are two main reasons that we even have eligibility criteria in cancer clinical trials. One, of course, is related to ensuring the safety of the research participants, to be sure that somehow it's not unsafe for them to receive the intervention that's being tested in the clinical trial. And the second main reason is, particularly in intervention studies, there's always a goal to try, in the study design, to try to isolate the effect of the intervention so that you can, as clearly as possible, determine whether it is having whatever the hypothesized effect is. And therefore, there's always a goal to minimize confounding factors in the trial population that might diminish your ability to isolate the effect of the intervention. And so, historically, clinical trials over many years have gotten, I think, more and more rigid in their design, have tended to exclude more and more patient populations, to the point that, we've sort of now encountered another big problem, which is that the participants in cancer clinical trials, and I'm sure, and this is true in many other therapeutic areas, really no longer resemble the population for whom the treatment is intended to be used. So when you finally get the results of the study, the question is it actually applicable to the patient that you're seeing in your clinic the next day, who in most cases would not likely have qualified to participate in the study. So we have to resolve this. ASCO spent a couple of years really working through some of these issues. There are many more yet to be approached. We did it in a collaboration with Friends of Cancer Research, a patient advocacy organization that's been very active in the regulatory areas in oncology. We did it with the full input and collaboration of the FDA. We had many working groups that worked over several years that included oncologists, FDA representatives, patient advocates, clinical trialists, and so on, and trying to approach a few issues. All of this work was published last October in our journal, the Journal of Clinical Oncology, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on any of this, but these are the areas that we addressed. And basically, as I go through these quickly, what we essentially have tried to do in these recommendations is to flip the current state from saying that all of these patient populations are a priori excluded from clinical trials to all of these patient populations should be a priori included in clinical trials unless there's a strong rationale for excluding them. So patients with brain metastases, a group commonly excluded from cancer clinical trials, the recommendations essentially are that patients who have treated or clinically stable brain metastases should be included in clinical trials unless there's a compelling reason to exclude them. Even patients with active untreated or progressive brain metastases might be good candidates to be included depending upon their clinical state. And in fact, the only way we're going to discover the effectiveness of new drugs on the treatment of brain metastases is to have patients with brain metastases in the clinical trials. We did a lot of work on minimum age requirements. Almost all cancer clinical trials are intended, of course, for adults. Those are the people who most commonly have cancer. There's a whole separate arena of clinical trials for children with cancer. But increasingly, particularly with the targeted therapies that Bev mentioned, many of the molecular pathways that are targeted by these drugs occur in childhood tumors as well as in tumors occurring in adults. There's really no particular reason to keep at least older children, adolescents, and adolescents out of clinical trials designed for adults. So we basically recommended that clinical trial eligibility extend from the standard of 18 down to age 12, again, unless there's a compelling reason to exclude those younger patients from the trials. Same with HIV positive patients. Historically, that's a group that's been excluded from many clinical trials. In the early years, of course, before there were effective HIV treatments, these patients were typically excluded because they had a significant medical illness that had a poor prognosis in many cases in its own right, that had many complications associated with it, that had many complex treatment regimens associated with it. Nowadays, of course, that the treatments for HIV are so much more effective, this really, just becomes another part of your past medical history, really, and the medications that you take for this are just another set of concomitant medications that need to be accounted for in managing patients on a cancer clinical trial. So unless one anticipates some sort of drug-drug interaction with the HIV treatments, and even those can oftentimes be overcome with appropriate dose modifications. These are patients who should be in trials. Organ dysfunction, typically very narrowly defined, oftentimes excludes many patients from clinical trials, particularly kidney dysfunction. And so, again, we've made recommendations to broaden eligibility criteria, especially around renal function. It's a bit more difficult with hepatic function because there actually are no good clinical markers of liver function that directly relate to drug clearance. So there it's a bit more complicated, but even there we think the criteria that are commonly used, which essentially require normal liver function, should be liberalized. And we have recommendations regarding previous and concurrent malignancies. This is a huge exclusion for many patients with cancer. And of course, many people who have one cancer ultimately get a second cancer. And so the notion that you should exclude a patient who previously had cancer from participating in a clinical trial for their current cancer doesn't make a lot of sense, and we're recommending against that. We're recommending even that patients who have an ongoing concurrent malignancy could be included in a clinical trial of a new cancer if their concurrent cancer is not one that requires a tumor-directed therapy, that may confound the intervention being tested in the clinical trial. So just conclude, and let me just say before I get to this slide, what we're doing now in terms of trying to implement these recommendations. So we are working both with the National Cancer Institute and with the FDA to modify their standard protocol templates to have our language become the boilerplate, okay? And just to point out, just because it's boilerplate doesn't mean you have to use it. It means you could use it. But particularly since there's this tendency to just replicate, whatever is in the template, in the model protocol, we're working with FDA and NCI to have our recommendations now replace the previous recommendations in the model consent forms. We're working with all the NCI cooperative groups. We'll be speaking at all the cooperative group meetings now and in the fall to put forward these recommendations. And we're already seeing some adoption. Just turning on the final slide to some considerations for patients with mental illness, most of which have been touched on already. And again, I'm looking at this from the perspective of a cancer physician and clinical trialist, not from the perspective of a mental health expert. But I think, I tried to bucket these into 4 categories. There are the ethical issues that have been brought up already. What's the capacity of patients with mental illness to understand the informed consent process, understand the risks, benefits, and alternatives available to them for their cancer treatment? Are there safety issues? What's the ability of patients with mental illness to comply with treatment and monitoring of treatment, and to recognize and report and manage the adverse events that could occur in patients undergoing cancer treatment? There's the research compliance issues that Beverly alluded to. Unfortunately, in the regulatory world in which we live, clinical trial sites get audited. And if there are significant numbers of patients with significant protocol deviations, that's a black mark, and that could actually limit a site's ability to be able to participate in clinical trials over a longer period of time. So that's another area in clinical research that I believe needs to be loosened up, but that's a separate discussion. And then the final point I wanted to make is this issue that I'm referring to as investigator bias. Some of you called it stigma. And it really relates to the fact that the oncologist who is approaching the patient about participating in the clinical trial may have certain biases that confound their objective assessment of the other 3 things. And I'll just end by pointing out that although we're talking about mental illness, this is an issue that is a big issue in another population of patients who commonly have cancer, which are older people. And if you think about this, most cancers occur in people 65 and older. However, if you look at the percent of patients 65 and older who participate in cancer clinical trials, it's typically 20% or less. And if you look at the population of patients 70 and older who participate in cancer clinical trials, it's about 10% or less. So the very people that we are treating in our oncology clinics every day are not represented in the clinical trials that are determining the treatments that they get. And one of the main reasons that older people don't participate in clinical trials is because the doctor never recommends a clinical trial to them, because the doctor has a significant bias that they may not be able to participate in those trials. So I hope this is some food for thought, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I have a question for the panel, and then we'll open it up. I'm not sure how much time we have. You can.
Yeah, I think why don't we go to 11:40 and we'll go straight to breakouts after that. We'll see how that.
Okay, beautiful, beautiful. So, everybody touched upon a lot of different aspects of cancer and mental illness and clinical trials and research and engagement. And I'm, thinking about it's the access versus availability, right? Like the treatment is available. We believe good treatment is available around the city, but patients aren't accessing the treatment or not in a timely manner. And I'll give you an example. We did some work up in Lowell in in a church, kind of a Pan-African church, and eventually we started doing some studies, qualitative and quantitative studies up there, and determined that their health needs were great, and there was health care all around them, but they weren't accessing it. And so the question is, how do we get into these communities and actually connect so that, and do, health literacy training and education and all of that, so that the individuals in the communities are comfortable utilizing the health systems, and even, they weren't even utilizing primary care. So how do we, make it as part of our practice and our work to engage communities? Yep.
Recently acknowledged her bipolar disorder, Mariah Carey. I feel I'm channeling her every time I hold the mic. So FYI, that's happening for me while I'm saying this. No, I think one of the opportunities that we have in mental health is the idea of community-based, mobile and/or home-based care. Used widely in care for older adults, in palliative care, as I understand it. There's widespread and extensive use of home health care, and it often has lower costs than that provided in a clinic or hospital. So I think there's an opportunity there in terms of meeting people where they are. That's in terms of their conditions, it's in terms of their cultural context, et cetera. It's also perhaps true in terms of their geography and comfort level with surroundings. Another opportunity, I believe this was spoken to in the opening comments, peer specialists. Individuals who have lived experience of a mental health condition, and in the case of diverse populations, even I would think in the case of people who experience cancer as well, you can have multiple peer layers, right? So you can share the fact that you're peers with mental health conditions, you can share your cultural background, you can share gender identity, sexuality. You can share, the fact that you are experiencing or have experienced cancer. So I think those are two opportunities that would address both the oncology-related issues, but then also those you brought up.
Anyone else? Comments?
I'll just add one thing, which is, you mentioned the primary care doctors. I mean, I think, of course, the primary care doctors and the surgeons and the OB-GYNs are the primary gateway to the oncologist, because those are the doctors who are often involved in the first evaluation of a patient, who might have cancer. So if they, if they have some significant concerns or bias about whether a patient with mental illness could successfully undergo cancer treatment, those patients may never even get to the oncologist. So, I think that's an important issue that we have to consider.
I'll say another thing, and I'm looking at Jonathan Jackson, who's in the audience. This is his bailiwick, right? And community-based engagement is incredibly important. And since the panel's about research, health empowerment, and actual and getting to the point where patients with cancer and mental illness, or from any other underserved population, understand how valuable and important research is, it makes it, in many senses, easier for us to enroll these patients into trials, because the patients are coming and understanding and asking about it and valuing it. So those efforts are really important and have to be front and center for any cancer center or any mental health organization.
Great. Audience questions? Are you the mic person? One over there.
Bob Russo, Director of Recovery, Metro Boston Area Department of Mental Health. Two things on your insistence on patient family-centered treatment, which is great, except that your language is incomprehensible to most of the patients that you're trying to help. So I really want to bring up the issue of the importance and power of language and urge the medical community to reflect on human experience language as opposed to diagnostic and clinical language. I think it's a barrier that prevents the individuals you're trying to serve from becoming more personally engaged and responsible for their own recovery and health. So that would be that's a major one. And for Andrew, I just finished a PCORI study where I was the person at the table with the mental health challenge and the substance use challenge. So I'm a person in long-time recovery from co-occurring disorders. And I think the phrase that, many of you may have heard this phrase, but I'd like to reinforce it because I think it's so important for the wonderful work that Kelly is doing, that all of us are doing, and that is nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us. So it's a partnership. It's a partnership. It takes your expertise and knowledge and training, but it has to be communicated in such a way that a connection is made and we can move forward together. So thank you for letting me share these reflections with all of you.
If I could respond to that, one of the great things in the partnership that Alan and I have had, along with other members of the Mood Network team, is understanding the curse of knowledge. And if you've never heard that phrase, it's that you know something so deeply you can no longer even think that someone doesn't know what you know. And so as clinicians, as researchers, I think we fail frequently in trying to communicate things because our acronyms are used too often. I have now developed acronym phobia. They make me afraid. I never know what somebody's, I never know what people are talking about anymore when they use 10 acronyms in a row. It's really made me very sensitive to what we do in the Mood Network particularly, but that's spread outward, so that what we're saying is understandable. Because we could talk all we want, but it's not what we say, it's what really people hear.
I wanted to acknowledge that your point that you brought up actually did so. DBSA in 2010, 2011, so we need to do it again, I think, did some surveys of our constituency about attitudes about research and also concerns related to privacy. We then did a series of focus groups, and in the focus groups, the issue of language did come up frequently. And I, as a person with mental health conditions since I was 17, when I started working as a mental health advocate and people would talk about language, I would get a little eye-rolly and I'd be like, well, shouldn't we talk about, other things? I realized, though, here I am, like a middle-aged white dude, it's pretty, distancing language. Well, I everything else goes my way, and so I wasn't bugging me. I think that you really do have to look at that, and that was validated by, wasn't, research technically, but it was focus groups, and it was one of the most predominant issues. And if it were possible, I don't know if you're uploading materials, but DBSA has some, 10. Sorry, depression. Yeah, acronym, right? That was good. We have some resources that we'd love to share, and I just wanted to say thanks.
I think that brings up a really good point, which is that this is just a day, but really the hope is that this is a collaborative of all of the people in this room, that we're building a community network. I see leadership from the National Alliance of Mental Illnesses here, from the American Society of Clinical Oncology, from throughout Mass General and Dana-Farber, and many other places. And really the hope is that you upload materials and send them to me and that we continue the dialogue. And I know that I'm really looking forward to the breakout sessions, which are going to be much more hands-on. We're going to gain some concrete skills and really work on bringing that back to the room to really have a clear agenda. What are your priorities from where you're coming from? And how we can kind of advance research. Very briefly, I think we talk a lot sometimes about how do we get patients into our research study. I've learned a lot this year by spending a lot of time going out to where people are. And I mean, I say that because I think it does take time, but it's been incredibly valuable. And it has really opened up the interest in research from people with very different training, the hunger for education, whether you're a nurse or a program manager or just a person in the community. People just were scared by research, right? It's scary, people know what it is, it's scientific. And similarly, oncologists are scared of people with schizophrenia, sometimes. And so what I did there, I actually spent some time with oncologists hanging out, being helpful. And I have my own biases too. And people teach me about that by spending time with me. So I hope that can be kind of a frame that we can bring to the breakout sessions, because this is really a call to action. It's not, hey, here's some knowledge. It's here's your marching orders and let's make this work and do something meaningful as a collaborative that's going to mitigate this disparity. As Dr. Ryan said, we've got work to do, rigorous work informed by love that can really have a meaningful impact. So I want to give concrete information about the breakout sessions, but that is something that someone other than me should do. Is it going to fly? It's up there. All right, awesome. So in this room, serious mental illness, you can see them up there. So you don't have to go to the one that you were on, but I can read them if you want me to. Sure. So the first one here is serious mental illness, managing psychiatric symptoms and cancer care, community mental health. You guys can read it. Right? I'm happy to read them. I wanted to say more about what they are, which is really an interdisciplinary collaboration. The first piece of it is about education, but the majority of it is about us problem solving together. So bringing together people from community mental health with oncology, primary care, researchers across disciplines to learn about serious mental illness, to learn about palliative care. I'm really excited to have such a robust panel, including an attorney, awesome, the Optimum Care Committee, really think thoughtfully about challenges at the end of life, communicating effectively across disciplines and with peers, with people from different places. How do we do that in a way that actually works? And how do we help people with serious mental illness get through the continuum of cancer care? And so I think that it'll be a really valuable experience that will also have patients, people in the room. So I think that that's important just for us to have as that frame when we're thinking about our language and thinking about what we say, that we'll be a rich and mixed audience and we'll do our best to listen to each other. Thank you very much.
Again, I want to thank the panel for participation. This was very valuable. Thank you.